Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Terumos, Chapter 3, Halacha 2, in the Art Scroll on 28b1, and this is part 2 of this year. Now, we were dealing in part 1 about what happens where you have a partnership, and the deal with the partnership is what happens if you don't really know the status of tithing, like how they're going to be with their learning and their tithing with the other partner. Maybe they're not going to be tithing accurately, and then you might get into Demai issues. And in part 2 this year, really what we're going to be getting into is what happens where you have a worker. One worker is learned, and the owner is going to be an Amma Aretz. So the Mishnah was saying that Rabbi Yossi says that if the first partner separated an appropriate amount of truma, that the truma of the second partner is not truma. But if the first partner did not separate an appropriate amount of truma, the truma of the second part is truma. So let's unpack that. And, really, the Gemara is going to try to clarify what does Rabbi Yossi's statement even mean at all. So the Gemara says, what is this amount that Rabbi Yossi refers to? Does he mean that the first partner designated no more than the minimum amount or the minute amount that suffices for the truma separation under biblical law? Now, keep in mind that most opinions are going to be that even if you tithe a single kernel of grain, that is going to suffice for biblical amount. But it's going to come up elsewhere that Rabbi Yochanan actually says that it's going to be 1 in 100 is going to be Doraita. So we know that tithing today is going to be 1/40th, 1/50th, 1/60th, but Rabbi Yochanan is going to be saying that there is a minimum amount. It's going to be 1 in 100, and he's going to learn that from the sages and tradition. But there's a lot of dissent on that, and they're going to be saying that it's going to be the minimum amount. It's going to be like, even a single kernel of grain. So the question is, what is Rabbi Yossi talking about? Could it be that Rabbi Yossi is talking about where somebody tithed a single kernel of grain? The Gemara asks, or does he mean that the first partner designated an average amount of truma under the standards that were listed by the Torah scholars, namely 1/50th of the crop? Now, according to this interpretation, the second partner is presumed to consent to the truma separation of the first partner only if the designated portion amounts to 1/50th of the crop, and that's going to be the average ratio that the sages, the rabbis, prescribed. And the Rosh is going to be saying that if the first partner separated more or less than this measure, we presume that the second partner does not consent to that designation. Now, why might a partner not consent to the designation? Well, what happens if you have somebody who's tithing more than that? What if they're tithing generously? So maybe the other partner is not consenting to this. Maybe he just wants to have a meager tithe and not even an average tithe. So the question is that, if you don't really know the status of the learning of the other guy, well, maybe he's a cheap guy and maybe he doesn't learn so much and maybe he doesn't understand how it is. And maybe he doesn't consent even to an average tithing. Maybe he would want 1/60th, not 1/50th. Again, we're talking about, as we were covering in part 1 of this year, we're talking about where the two partners co-own the pile before they split it up, and one of them is tithing all of it. So the Gemara is going to look at this question and how it's interlinked with the question of whether Rabbi Yossi's statement in the Mishnah represents a third opinion that's at odds with the preceding view of both what Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis were talking about, or it's going to be an explanation of the rabbi's view. So the Gemara is going to look at this question as being linked up with the question about whether Rabbi Yossi's statement in this Mishnah represents a third opinion that is going to be actually at odds with what we learned in the end of part 1 of this year with the maloka between Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis, or is this just going to be an explanation of the rabbi's view? Gemara says if you interpret it as referring to the minute amount, that's going to be enough for the truma separation on biblical law, then Rabbi Yossi is not in agreement with the rabbis, but rather putting forward his own opinion, in other words, the third opinion. But if you interpret it as referring to the average amount of truma under the standards that the Torah scholars ordained, then Rabbi Yossi is actually in agreement with the rabbis. He's just coming to explain a nuance and qualify their view. So if Rabbi Yossi means that the first partner's designation is fully effective only when he separates the normal rabbinically prescribed amount, in other words, 1/50th of the crop, then the position of Rabbi Yossi is identical to the rabbis. And his statement in the Mishnah is just clarifying that the rabbi's ruling pertains specifically to cases in which the standard measure of truma would be separated. But on the other hand, since the Mishnah does not specify how much truma the first partner separated, perhaps we can assume that the reference is to, where the second partner is going to be designating a smaller amount. So if Rabbi Yossi is going to be understood by saying that the first partner can't effectively designate truma on behalf of the entire crop unless he separates the bare minimum necessary to rectify the produce on the biblical level, then it would seem that Rabbi Yossi is arguing with the rabbis, because the rabbis hold that for the designation to be fully effective, it's only going to be where the designated portion constitutes 1/50th of the crop. So if you're going to read it like that, it's going to be that Rabbi Yossi is going to be saying on a Doraita level, what's done is done, right? And this is just going to be a rabbinic fence. And the Gemara doesn't answer which it is. In other words, Yerushalmi doesn't bring a conclusion of really what Rabbi Yossi's statement is or how it should be interpreted. But the Rambam in Hilchos Terumos 4.8 records it as the halacha. In other words, he's indicating that Rabbi Yossi is to be understood as simply explaining that the view of the sages, which is going to be that you have to measure out 1/50th of the crop. And in other words, Rambam is taking the position that Rabbi Yossi is not arguing with the sages at all. Now, the Gemara is going to look at this clause in the Mishnah where it says, if after assigning an agent to separate truma from his produce, the owner nullified the agency, the law is as follows, is what the Mishnah is saying. It says, if he nullified the agency before the agent separated truma, the agent's truma is not truma, but if he nullified the agency after the agent separated truma, the agent's truma is truma. This is just standard fare for agencies. In other words, if somebody has a get and they've hired an agent to go deliver the get, if the agent delivers the get and then the man wants to cancel the agency, the get is delivered. It's already delivered, and that's the halacha. But if he wants to cancel the agency before the get is given, and then the get is given after the agency is canceled, it's not a valid get. Same is going to be over here. If he made an agency to separate out truma, and the guy didn't separate out truma yet, the agent didn't separate out truma, well, it's going to be canceled. It's no longer a valid agency. But if you already separated out truma, then the owner cancels the agency after, what's done is done. That separation is valid. So the Gemara is going to ask, does this ruling of our Mishnah not contradict the statement of Rish Lakish? Rish Lakish said, this Gemara, that a person could not nullify his assignment of agency with mere words. And this Mishnah indicates that an oral declaration is going to be enough to nullify an agency. So in Bavli Kiddushin 59a, it's going to talk about a maloka between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, about somebody who authorized the agent to perform a transaction on his behalf, and he wants to revoke the agency. And the specific case is going to be where the woman appointed an agent to accept Kiddushin from a man to whom she wishes to become betrothed. But then she declares that she no longer wants the agent to act on his behalf. So an issue here is whether the appointment of the agency can be nullified with an oral retraction. Rabbi Yochanan says that the oral retraction is enough to nullify the agency. Rish Lakish says that you can't just verbally nullify it, and the words cannot come and negate other words. That's what Rish Lakish's point is. And so Rish Lakish is holding that the woman's oral revocation of the agency can't nullify her earlier authorization. So the Gemara now is going to be looking at the view of Rish Lakish over here, who's noting that maybe it's inconsistent with the Mishnah's ruling that one who appointed an agent to separate truma on his behalf can revoke his agent or agency with an oral declaration to that effect. So the the Gemara says that interpret the Mishnah as dealing with a case where the owner originally said to the agent, go and designate Truma at the north end of the pile, and instead the agent went and designated Truma at the south end of the pile. And in this situation, even Rish Lakish agrees that the earlier oral retraction of the owner is effective by nullifying the agent's authority to separate out Truma. In other words, that the Rish Lakish and this seeming contradiction is resolved by showing that the Mishnah refers to a case where the agent did not do what he was supposed to do in separating out Truma, and he didn't really follow the instructions of the owner. In other words, he designated produce from a different side of the pile than that which the owner specified. And that in itself seems to be a minor deviation, and there's non-compliance over here. So when you couple this together with the owner's declaration that he's nullifying the agency, it should be enough grounds for canceling the designation, even by Rish Lakish's standards. So the Gemara is going to look at the final section of the Mishnah, and it's going to say that workers do not have the authority to separate out Truma except for the treaders. These are going to be people who smush the wine, the grapes on the wine, and that's going to be because the owners will convey Truma to the contents of the wine press. And in other words, this is going to be where you have an Amma Aretz who doesn't really know how to, stay tahor, that's going to be pure. And he's hiring Chavarim who do know how. And they're going to be the workers who are going to be working on the grapes. And the workers, in this case, are going to have the permission to separate out Truma, because this is presumably what they're being hired for, even without the express consent. In other words, this is, by the way, there's a beautiful Gemara in Meiser Sheni 5.2 that's talking about, the demand for grapes and how expensive grapes were in the time of the Bet HaMikdash, because you always had to make tahor wine. And so, there's really a lot of pressure to get tahor wine, especially when you have the Bet HaMikdash, because you need it for the service. So the Gemara is going to specify at what point the treaders are supposed to separate out the Truma. Rabbi Yochanan says, once the treaders have walked on the grapes across the length and the breadth of the wine press and left it unattended, we immediately regard the contents of the cistern as being tameh, because the owner, who's an Amaretz, might come and handle the wine. So the treaders have to be careful to separate out Truma as soon as that early stage has been reached. In other words, Rabbi Yochanan is saying as soon as they walk, up and back, and then, left and right, that right away they have to separate it out. They can't leave it unattended, even if the boards are still there, because maybe the owner will come in and touch it. And there's an objection. There's a brisa who taught that regarding workers who separate out Truma from the cistern without being authorized to do so, their Truma is not valid Truma, because we can't presume that the owner consents to their action. But if the cistern is small so that the contents are going to be particularly vulnerable to being rendered tameh by people who are curious and passing by, or if others are expected to dabble with the contents of the cistern, then the worker's Truma is going to be valid Truma. And in these situations, we can presume that the owner desires the Truma to be separated before the contents of the cistern are exposed to Truma. In other words, this is why the guy is hiring these Chavarim in the first place. So the Gemara assumes that the Brisa's ruling is going to be dealing with workers at the wine press, and it's going to pose a question. It's going to say that in the last clause, the worker's Truma is valid only because others are expected to dabble with the wine. So the owner might want the Truma to be separated right away. So Gemara says, by implication, the circumstances are such that we do not expect others to dabble with the wine, and then the worker's Truma is not valid Truma. So what now can we say to reconcile Rabbi Yochanan's view that the treaders are actually going to be empowered to separate out Truma as soon as they walk across the length and the breadth of the wine press? And the Gemara says here, in Rabbi Yochanan's statement, we're dealing with the production of wine. And here, where we're talking about the brisa over there, we're dealing with the production of oil. And the Gemara is going to seek clarification. It says, but are not wine and oil the same in that regard? In other words, why would the laws be different? And the Gemara explains. It says, in the case of wine, the exposure to Truma is prevalent, But in the case of oil, the exposure to tuma is not prevalent. So that seems hard to understand. The Rosh Hashanah is going to explain that it's routine for people to sample newly produced wine, and many of the people coming to sample it will be an Amaretz who might turn the wine into be tameh because they're not learned. So as a result, the workers involved in the first stage of the wine production, the treaders, are going to be presumed to have the authority to designate out truma even without the owner's explicit consent in order to ensure that the truma will be tuhor. By contrast, the workers who are hired to press olives are not automatically empowered to separate out truma for the oil because plain oil is unlikely to be rendered tameh by other people coming by to sample it. So the Gemara is going to look at a brisa on this topic. It's going to be relevant to it. There's a brisa that taught in Tosefta 3:11 that from when do workers separate truma from the grapes in the wine press? And it says from when they have walked on the grapes across the length and the breadth of the wine press. And where do we consider the wine possibly tameh? At what point are we going to actually suspect that maybe the owner came and tasted some of the wine and turned the whole pile into become tameh wine? Bet Shammai says only from when the Meiser Sheni has been removed from it. And Bet Hillel says that the wine will be regarded as possibly tameh even earlier, from when the Meiser Rishon is removed from it, even though the Meiser Sheni has not been removed from it. In other words, that in the normal tithing, it's going to be first you separate out the truma, you give that to the Kohen, then he separates out the Meiser Rishon, which he gives to a Levi, and the Levi then goes and separates out truma Meiser, which gives to a Kohen. And then after all that, you can take out the Meiser Sheni, and that has to be in Jerusalem, or you redeem it with money. But Bet Shammai is saying that we can assume that the owner, who's an Am Aretz, will avoid touching the wine until the workers have gone through all of the tithes, including Meiser Sheni. And Bet Hillel maintains that unlearned people generally don't have any compunction to exposing Meiser Sheni to Tuma because Meiser Sheni is something that they themselves will eat. And furthermore, because even Meiser Sheni that has become Tameh can be redeemed with money that can purchase Tahor food in Jerusalem, everyone will say basically that it's essential for just the Meiser Rishon or the Truma Gedola to stay Tahor, and they're going to be lax on the other tithes. That's basically what he's saying. And the Brisa is going to be saying that Rabbi Yossi says the halacha accords with the opinion of Bet Shammai that the wine is not suspected of having been rendered tameh until the Meiser Sheni is separated. However, the masses have become accustomed to act in accordance with the opinion of Bet Hillel, and we treat the wine as tameh as soon as the Meiser Rishon has been removed. So there's a compromise view. Rabbi Shimon says that the words of Bet Shammai appear correct during the time of the temple era, and the words of Bet Hillel appear correct in the times nowadays after the temple has been destroyed. So with the destruction of the temple, Meiser Sheni becomes forbidden for consumption even in Jerusalem, and in the present era, therefore, you don't need to prevent Meiser Sheni from becoming tameh since it can't be eaten in any case. So consequently, once Meiser Rishon has been removed from the wine, we can suspect that the owner has rendered the wine tameh. This is going to be Bet Hillel's point. Rabbi Kanievsky adds that when the temple stood, the Meiser Sheni would still be eaten in Jerusalem, and the Torah status had to be preserved. And therefore, we do not suspect the wine of having been rendered tameh until the Meiser Sheni has been removed. That's what Bet Shammai is ruling. There's another opinion. The sages say the law is not in accordance with the words of this one or in accordance with that one. In other words, it's neither Bet Shammai or Bet Hillel, but rather one removes Truma and Truma Meiser as soon as there's enough wine to do so. In other words, we're going to immediately regard the wine as being in the cistern that's left over as being possibly tameh. In other words, the sages are saying that the wine is consistently in jeopardy of being exposed to tuma, and therefore the workers have to be diligent to separate out specific tithes as soon as there's enough wine that's there. The moment there's enough wine for truma or truma meiser, then that portion should be set aside. Once that's done, the remaining wine might be regarded as tameh. So the Gemara is going to be looking at things with the tithing of wine, and the Gemara is going to look at a brisa that discusses the tithing of olives. So when do workers separate truma from olives that they are pressing? And it says that there are teachers of brises who teach that from when the olives are ground, and there's another teacher of brises who teaches from when the olives are laden. In other words, that the pressing beam happens and that's placed before they're going to be ground up. And in other words, really what it's asking is what point do they separate truma from, the oil produced by olives. Now, to produce olive oil back then, there was a heavy beam that was placed on top of the olives, and the weight of the beam would press some of the oil out. And then the olives are going to be taken from under the beam and ground with a millstone, and then placed under a beam again for more pressing. So the first version of this brisa is going to be saying that the workers should set aside truma from the oil as soon as the grinding is completed. And the second version says as soon as the beam is put on for the initial pressing. So the Gemara is going to look at this dispute, and it's going to say that the law is well understood according to the one who says that the truma should be separated at the beginning of the press from when the olives are laden with the pressing beam. But according to the one who says that the truma is separated only later from when the olives are ground with the mill, the following question comes up. It says, has not Rabbi Yochanan said with regard to the production of wine that as soon as the treaders have walked upon the grapes across the length and the breadth of the wine press, we immediately regard the contents of the cistern as becoming possibly tamei? Rabbi Yochanan requires that the treaders separate truma at the very beginning of the process because afterward the owner is liable to make the wine tamei. So presumably that should also be for olives. So the Gemara is going to answer as it did before. It says rather here in Rabbi Yochanan's statement we're dealing with the production of wine, and here this brisa we're dealing with the production of oil. So it says, but are not wine and oil the same in this regard? In other words, in terms of production, what's the basic difference between wine production and oil production? Gemara explains, it says, in the case of wine, the exposure to truma is prevalent, so truma has to be separated from it immediately. And in the case of oil, the exposure for truma is not prevalent. Therefore, you can wait until it's ground. And in other words, people are going to be less likely to render the oil tamei by coming and sampling and touching it and fiddling with it than for wine. There's another answer. Rabbi Chia Bar Ada says that both here regarding wine and here regarding olive oil, truma is actually present. But still, the exposure to truma is more prevalent for wine than oil. In other words, people will touch olive oil as much as they're going to touch wine, but wine is going to be more likely than oil to become tamei because of the sherets. And, there's going to be maybe a sheretz that might be attracted to coming and drinking from it or something like that. And in the brisa, the earliest time given from when truma should be separated from olive oil is when the beam was loaded onto the olives to start to press it. This is before it goes to the mill, to the millstone. And the Gemara is going to talk about a Tana who provides an even earlier time for separating out truma from oil. And it says that there was a brisa that taught that Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Yudah, said that if one wishes to separate out truma from olive oil as soon as possible, he may bring some of the unprocessed olives and place them beneath the millstone and pass it to and fro. In other words, do a little bit of oil and do that as the truma right away. And so, in other words, Marafullah explains that Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Yudah, is saying that one who is concerned about the possibility of the oil becoming tamei can go ahead and produce a small amount of oil by putting the millstone over the olives and set that aside for the cone right away. This is going to be the same as the treaders walking across the length and breadth of the wine press, which Rabbi Yochanan established, and then taking the wine out right away as the ties. And the ruling is opposed. The sages said back to Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Yudah, and said that olives are not comparable to grapes, because where grapes are soft and readily going to release the wine that they contain, olives are hard and they do not readily release the oil they contain. In other words, that although walking the length and breadth of the wine press is going to be enough to allow truma to come about in the case of wine, that just putting them in the millstone is not going to produce oil that's going to be suitable for the truma separation. Rather, you have to wait until the later stages of the olive pressing at the very earliest when the olives are laden by the pressing beam. In other words, that they're saying that this is really an essential part of it, that the oil, the liquid that's released by the olives before the loading of the beam is not really considered oil. Therefore, it's unsuitable. And so they're really saying that you have to go through the entire process and it's going to release a better quality oil. And this thing that you just take by putting it in the millstone is really not oil. And you really just made something else. You made olive tapenade. You didn't make olive oil. And so, this putting the beam on there to start to crush them and press them. This is going to be an essential part of the production they're going to be claiming. And then after that, now you grind it out, and the flesh has become ready for oil to come out, and that is going to be where they say that you start to do the tithes. Anyway, a lot going on over here, and in Halacha 3, we're going to get to the Truma designation without actually removing it from the pile, just making a declaration, and we're going to see how that could be. Have a great day.